The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood silently, watching his pilots prepare for what many believed would be another crushing victory for the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was June 4, 1942, and for 6 months, Japan had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami, conquering territory from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies. The Empire's naval forces had seemed invincible, their Zero fighters cutting through enemy aircraft like samurai swords through silk. But on this fateful morning, approaching the small atoll of Midway, something felt different. The usual confidence that had carried them through their string of victories seemed tempered by an underlying tension that Nagumo couldn't quite place. The admiral had no way of knowing that American codebreakers had already penetrated the Japanese naval communications, turning their greatest strength surprise into their most dangerous weakness. 6 months earlier, the attack on Pearl Harbor had stunned the world. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda had led his torpedo bombers and dive bombers in a perfectly coordinated assault that left the American Pacific Fleet crippled and smoking in the Hawaiian harbor. The success had been so complete, so devastating that it seemed to validate every strategic calculation made by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and the Japanese Naval General Staff. Following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had rolled forward with mechanical precision. Hong Kong fell on December 25, 1941. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered on February 15, 1942, in what Winston Churchill would later call the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The Dutch East Indies collapsed by March 9, delivering crucial oil resources into Japanese hands. Each victory had reinforced the growing belief among Japanese commanders that their forces were not merely superior, they were unstoppable. The Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, had changed everything when Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's 16 B-25 bombers appeared over Tokyo, Yokohama, and other Japanese cities. They delivered more than just bombs, they delivered a profound psychological shock. The home islands, sacred and inviolable, had been touched by enemy fire. Emperor Hirohito himself had felt the tremors of American bombs, and the Japanese military leadership knew they had to respond decisively. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, conceived the Midway operation as the decisive blow that would finally cripple American naval power in the Pacific. His plan was elegant in its complexity. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American attention north, while the main force would seize Midway Atoll, forcing the remaining American fleet to come out and fight on Japanese terms. With Midway captured, Japan would have an advance base just 1,100 miles from Hawaii, perfectly positioned for the final assault on the American mainland. The Japanese fleet that sailed toward Midway was the most powerful naval force ever assembled. For aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu formed the heart of Nagumo's first air fleet, carrying over 150 aircraft. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers. Additional forces included Yamamoto's main battle fleet with 3 battleships, including his flagship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. As reported by military historian Gordon Prange in his definitive work Miracle at Midway, the Japanese approached the battle with supreme confidence, having never lost a major naval engagement since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through 1905. But confidence had bred complacency. Japanese intelligence gathering had become sloppy, their communications security lax. Most critically, they had underestimated their enemy's ability to recover and adapt. While Japanese commanders planned their grand offensive, American codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rockford, worked frantically at Pearl Harbor's Combat Intelligence Office, piece by piece reconstructing Japanese battle plans from intercepted radio transmissions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. As Nagumo's carriers approached Midway through the pre-dawn darkness of June 4th, neither he nor his pilots could imagine that within hours, their seemingly invincible fleet would be burning beneath the Pacific sun. and Japan's path to victory would transform into a road leading inexorably toward defeat. In the basement of Pearl Harbor's administrative building, fluorescent lights hummed over banks of radio equipment and stacks of decoded Japanese messages. Commander Joseph Rockford, a tall, thin man who had spent months living on coffee and determination, studied the latest intercepts with growing excitement. After weeks of painstaking work, his team at Station HYPO had achieved what many thought impossible. They had broken the Japanese Navy's primary operational code, JN-20-5. The breakthrough had come gradually, built on mathematical analysis, linguistic patterns, and inspired guesswork. Rocheford's team had identified that Japanese messages repeatedly referenced target AF, but determining what AF represented had required clever deception. The Americans transmitted a false message stating that Midway's water purification system had broken down. Within days, Japanese intercepts mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The trap had worked perfectly. If was Midway. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, faced an agonizing decision. Rocheford's intelligence indicated that Admiral Yamamoto was planning the largest naval operation in history. With over 160 ships converging on Midway, the American fleet, still recovering from Pearl Harbor, could muster only 3 aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, which had limped back from the Coral Sea battle with a massive hole in her flight deck. The odds seemed insurmountable. Japan's 4 aircraft carriers alone carried more planes than the entire American force. Their pilots were veterans of Pearl Harbor, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, and the Indian Ocean raids that had sunk British carriers Hermes and several heavy cruisers. Many had over 1,000 hours of combat experience, making them among the most skilled naval aviators in the world. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet, embodied the quiet professionalism that would characterize American leadership throughout the war. A surface warfare specialist suddenly thrust into carrier operations. Spruance compensated for his lack of aviation experience with methodical planning and unshakable composure. His counterpart, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher aboard Yorktown, commanded the overall American force with 3 carriers against Japan's 4. On May 27, 1942, the Japanese strike force departed from their bases, confident in their numerical superiority and proven tactical excellence. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had never lost a battle, and their aircraft had swept enemy opposition from the skies across half the Pacific. The Zero fighter remained unmatched in air-to-air combat, while Japanese torpedo bombers and dive bombers had demonstrated devastating effectiveness against both ships and shore installations. However, American preparations revealed growing tactical sophistication. Captain Mark Mitcher aboard Hornet and Captain George Murray on Enterprise had drilled their air crews relentlessly, emphasizing coordinated attacks and aggressive pursuit of enemy carriers. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, Enterprise's Air Group Commander, had studied Japanese carrier operations extensively, identifying potential vulnerabilities in their defensive patterns. The Americans possessed one crucial advantage that would prove decisive: radar. While Japanese carriers relied on visual spotting and radio communications, American ships carried the new CXAM radar system, providing early warning of incoming attacks and precise tracking of enemy formations. This technological edge, combined with superior damage control techniques developed after Pearl Harbor, would level the playing field in ways Japanese planners had never considered. As the opposing fleets converged on Midway, both sides prepared for what they believed would be the decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. Japanese pilots performed ritual ceremonies, writing final letters to families they might never see again. American aircrews attended briefings where intelligence officers, drawing on Rocheford's intercepts, provided unprecedented detail about enemy positions, timing, and intentions. The Americans also benefited from recent combat experience that Japanese intelligence had underestimated. The Battle of the Coral Sea in early May had been tactically inconclusive, but it had provided American pilots with their first opportunity to engage Japanese carriers. In daylight combat, lessons learned about Japanese defensive tactics, the vulnerability of their carriers during flight operations, and the importance of coordinated attacks would prove invaluable in the coming battle. On June 3, 1942, as both fleets moved toward their fateful rendezvous, the stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate how intelligence, technology, and tactical adaptation could overcome numerical superiority and combat experience. At precisely 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the aircraft carrier Akagi turned into the wind and began launching the first wave of what Admiral Nagumo believed would be the final crushing blow against American resistance in the Pacific. 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers, 36 Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters roared into the pre-dawn darkness, their engines creating a symphony of power that had become the signature sound of Japanese conquest. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the strike force toward Midway, flying at the head of a formation that represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval aviation. These were not the green pilots who would characterize later Japanese operations, but seasoned veterans who had honed their skills over China, perfected their techniques at Pearl Harbor, and demonstrated their mastery during the conquest of the Dutch East Indies. Many had flown combat missions for over 2 years, accumulating experience that their American counterparts could only dream of matching. On Midway itself, radar operators had detected the incoming formation at 150 miles distance. Major Floyd Parks, commanding the Marine Air Defenses, scrambled every available aircraft, 26 fighters including outdated Brewster F-2 Buffaloes and Grumman F-4F Wildcats. The Marines knew they were facing overwhelming odds, but they also understood that every minute they could delay the Japanese attack might prove crucial for the approaching American fleet. The aerial battle above Midway unfolded with tragic predictability. Japanese Zeros, faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans could field, sliced through the Marine fighter screen like wolves among sheep. Captain Marion Carl managed to shoot down one Zero before his Wildcat was riddled with cannon fire, forcing him to bail out over the lagoon. Major Parks himself was shot down and killed, along with 13 other Marine pilots. The sacrifice, however, was not in vain. The delays imposed by American fighters disrupted Japanese timing and forced Tomonaga's bombers to face intense anti-aircraft fire from alerted ground defenses. The Japanese attack on Midway's installations was professionally executed, but incomplete. Tomonaga's bombers struck the powerhouse, fuel tanks, and hangars, creating massive fires and destroying several aircraft on the ground. However, the runway remained operational, and critically, the island's radar installations survived intact. Most importantly for the coming battle, American aircraft based on Midway had already launched their own strike against the Japanese fleet. As military historian John Lundstrom documented in The First Team and the Guadalcanal Campaign, the American counterattack from Midway demonstrated both courage and the technological limitations facing American forces in early 1942. Captain Collins led 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers in the first American attack on Japanese carriers since the war began. These were brand new aircraft, so new that most crews had only minimal training on the type. Approaching at low altitude through intense anti-aircraft fire and Zero fighter attacks, 5 of the 6 Avengers were shot down, with Captain Collins among the dead. Only 1 aircraft returned, severely damaged and with its gunner wounded. Major Lofton Henderson's 16 Marine SPD Dauntless dive bombers followed, attempting to attack the carrier. Henderson, realizing his inexperienced pilots couldn't execute proper dive bombing attacks, ordered them to glide bomb from low altitude. The result was predictably devastating. Henderson was killed along with 7 other Marines, and no significant damage was inflicted on any Japanese ship. The most tragic attack came from Major James Fleming's 11 Marine SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers, aircraft so obsolete they were nicknamed wind indicators by their crews. Approaching the Japanese battleship Haruna, they faced a wall of anti-aircraft fire that shot down 2 aircraft and damaged several others. Fleming pressed his attack with such determination that he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. But the bombs caused only superficial damage. By 8:30 in the morning, the first phase of the Battle of Midway appeared to confirm Japanese expectations of easy victory. Their carriers remained undamaged, their fighter cover intact, and their offensive capability undiminished. American air power from Midway had been effectively neutralized, with minimal losses to the attacking force. Part 4. The Fatal Decision. 650 words aboard the flagship Akagi. Admiral Nagumo faced the kind of tactical decision that had defined his career and would ultimately seal Japan's fate in the Pacific. At 7:15 in the morning, as his strike aircraft continued their assault on Midway, Lieutenant Tomonaga's voice crackled over the radio with words that would change the course of history. There is need for a second attack. The runway at Midway remained operational, and American aircraft were still launching from the island. Nagumo's dilemma was complex and time-critical. His second wave of aircraft sat ready on the carrier decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, for attacking American ships should they appear. But Tomonaga's report suggested that Midway's defenses required another strike with high explosive and incendiary bombs designed for shore bombardment. The decision seemed logical. No American ships had been spotted, and neutralizing Midway completely would ensure the success of the overall operation. At 7:45, Nagumo made the fateful choice that would haunt Japanese naval strategy for the remainder of the war. He ordered his crews to begin rearming the second wave aircraft, switching from ship attack weapons to bombs suitable for a second strike on Midway. On the hangar decks below, ordnance crews began the laborious process of removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with high-explosive and incendiary weapons. Fuel lines snaked across the decks, ammunition lay scattered in staging areas, and the normal order of a combat-ready carrier dissolved into organized chaos. Exactly 30 minutes later, at 8:15, a lookout aboard the cruiser Tone shouted the words that would transform Nagumo's logical decision into a catastrophic mistake. Enemy surface ships sighted. The delayed scouting aircraft from Tone, launched 30 minutes behind schedule, due to mechanical problems, had finally located the American fleet. But the initial report was frustratingly vague. 10 enemy surface ships, course to for 0 degrees, speed 20 knots. The information was incomplete and potentially misleading. Were these ships the remnants of destroyers and cruisers, easily dispatched by dive bombers? Or did the force include the aircraft carriers that Japanese intelligence had insisted were still in port at Pearl Harbor? Nagumo desperately needed clarification. But radio communications with the scouting aircraft remained sporadic and unclear. At 8:30, an updated report arrived that stopped conversations throughout Akagi's bridge. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. The American fleet was not only present, it included the strike capability that could threaten his entire force. Nagumo now faced an impossible choice with devastating time pressure. His aircraft were halfway through the rearming process, leaving them unsuitable for either mission. His first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel and ammunition, requiring immediate recovery. And somewhere to the northeast, American carriers were undoubtedly preparing their own strike. The Admiral's decision-making process revealed the rigid tactical thinking that would characterize Japanese naval operations throughout the war, rather than launching an immediate attack with whatever aircraft were available. Nagumo chose to follow established doctrine, recover the returning Midway strike force, complete the rearming process, and then launch a properly coordinated attack on the American fleet. The decision was textbook perfect and strategically disastrous. As historian Walter Lord documented in Incredible Victory, the critical period between 8:30 and 10:30 on June 4th demonstrated how tactical excellence could become strategic catastrophe when facing an adaptive enemy. While Japanese deck crews worked frantically to complete the rearming process, American dive bombers were already airborne and approaching. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey had launched from Enterprise at 7 o'clock with 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, while Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 more. From Yorktown, the Americans were converging on the Japanese fleet at precisely the moment when Nagumo's carriers were most vulnerable. Flight decks crowded with fuel lines and ordnance, defensive fighters engaged with torpedo bombers at low altitude, and damage control teams scattered throughout the ships. The stage was set for the most decisive 30 minutes in naval aviation history. Nagumo's carriers, invincible for 6 months, were about to discover that tactical perfection meant nothing, when strategic initiative had shifted to an enemy who understood that victory belonged not to the most skillful, but to the most adaptable. At exactly 10:24 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey spotted for white wakes cutting through the blue Pacific, far below the Japanese carrier force that American intelligence had predicted would be at this precise location. After flying for nearly 2 hours and consuming fuel that left little margin for return, McCluskey's 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers had found their target. At the moment of maximum Japanese vulnerability, the timing was not coincidence, but the convergence of American intelligence, Japanese tactical doctrine, and pure combat luck. Admiral Nagumo's carriers were in the middle of the most dangerous phase of flight operations, launching and recovering aircraft simultaneously while rearming others on the hangar decks below. Fuel lines crisscrossed the flight decks, ammunition was stacked in staging areas, and the normal watertight integrity of the ships had been compromised to facilitate rapid aircraft operations. McCluskey made a decision that demonstrated the tactical flexibility that would characterize American naval operations for the remainder of the war. Rather than attacking all four carriers with dispersed small groups, he concentrated his dive bombers against two targets, Akagi and Kaga. At 10:26, he pushed over into his dive, leading his squadron down through increasingly intense anti-aircraft fire toward the flight deck of Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship. The first bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best, struck Akagi near the amidships elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where it exploded among aircraft being rearmed for the strike on American carriers. The second bomb hit aft, starting fires among parked aircraft loaded with fuel and ammunition. Within minutes, secondary explosions began tearing through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited and ordnance cooked off in the intense heat. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's 17 dive bombers from Yorktown were attacking the carrier Soryu. Leslie had lost his bomb due to a mechanical malfunction, but his pilots pressed home their attacks with devastating accuracy. 3 direct hits in rapid succession turned Soryu into a floating inferno, her flight deck buckling from internal explosions as fueled and armed aircraft added their destruction to the conflagration. The carrier Kaga, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, suffered perhaps the most devastating attack of all. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, having separated from McCluskey's group, led his 3-plane section in a textbook dive bombing attack that placed at least 4 bombs directly onto Kaga's flight deck and hangar. The explosions were so violent that the ship's superstructure visibly lifted from the blast effects, and within 20 minutes she was dead in the water, abandoned by her crew as ammunition explosions made firefighting impossible. In less than 10 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers had been transformed from instruments of conquest into burning pyres, the same ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, that had swept British naval power from the Indian Ocean, that had seemed invincible just hours earlier, were now blazing wrecks drifting helplessly on the Pacific swells aboard Akagi. Admiral Nagumo stood transfixed as his flagship died around him, the bridge filled with smoke from fires below. An explosion after explosion shook the vessel as her own weapons and fuel stores fed the inferno. Captain Taijiro Aoki finally forced the admiral to transfer to the cruiser Nagara, but not before Nagumo had witnessed the destruction of everything he had built. During 6 months of seemingly effortless victory, the psychological impact on Japanese aircrews was as devastating as the physical destruction of their ships. Pilots who had regarded themselves as invincible watched their carriers, their floating homes, and symbols of Japanese naval supremacy burn and sink beneath them. Many would later describe June 4th as the day they first understood that Japan could lose the war. As documented by military historian Jonathan Parshall in Shattered Sword. The loss of 3 carriers in 10 minutes represented more than tactical defeat. It marked the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific and the beginning of an irreversible strategic decline. Yet 1 Japanese carrier remained operational. Hiryu, separated from the other 3 ships, had escaped the American dive bomber attacks. Her aircraft were already launching a counterattack that would demonstrate that even in defeat, Japanese naval aviation retained the capacity to inflict devastating damage on their enemies. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier, watching pillars of black smoke rising from his sister ships on the horizon. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the veteran carriers that had spearheaded Japan's conquest of the Pacific, were burning, funeral pyres drifting on the morning swells. But Hiryu remained untouched, and Captain Kaku was determined to demonstrate that Japanese naval aviation could still strike with lethal precision even in the face of disaster. At 10:58 in the morning, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters from Hiryu's flight deck. Their mission clear: find and destroy the American carriers that had devastated the mobile fleet. These pilots represented the last reserve of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, men who had learned their trade over China and perfected their skills. During the conquest of Southeast Asia, they flew with the desperate courage of samurai facing inevitable defeat, knowing that their sacrifice might still salvage something from the morning's catastrophe. The American carrier Yorktown, veteran of the Coral Sea battle and hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor, became the target of Japanese vengeance. Captain Elliott, Buckmaster, had positioned his ship slightly ahead of Enterprise and Hornet, making Yorktown the most visible target for incoming Japanese aircraft. At noon, radar operators detected Kobayashi's formation approaching from the northwest, giving American fighters enough warning to scramble interceptors. The aerial battle above Yorktown demonstrated the tactical skill that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary, despite facing superior numbers of American fighters. Kobayashi's pilots fought their way through the defensive screens with devastating efficiency. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, leading Yorktown's fighter cover, watched helplessly as Japanese dive bombers broke through his formation and began their attacks on the carrier below. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck at 12:10, penetrating to the 4th deck and exploding in the rag storage compartment. The blast killed several sailors instantly and started fires throughout the forward section of the ship. A second bomb hit the funnel area, destroying the ship's radar, equipment, and disrupting communications between the bridge and damage control parties. A third bomb exploded near the forward elevator, buckling the flight deck and making aircraft operations impossible. Within 20 minutes, Yorktown was listing heavily to port, her speed reduced to 12 knots, and black smoke pouring from multiple fires. Captain Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship preparations, believing his vessel was doomed. The same Japanese pilots who had seemed invincible that morning had proven they could still inflict crippling damage even when facing overwhelming odds. But American damage control techniques, developed through painful experience since Pearl Harbor, proved superior to anything the Japanese had anticipated. Chief Warrant Officer Charles Delaney led damage control parties that contained the fires, counter-flooded to correct the list, and restored partial power within 2 hours. By 2:30 in the afternoon, Yorktown was making 20 knots and recovering her aircraft. A recovery that Japanese observers would have considered impossible. The reprieve proved temporary. At 2:45, Lieutenant Tomonaga returned with 10 torpedo bombers from Hiryu, determined to finish what the dive bombers had started. Tomonaga himself was flying a damaged aircraft, his fuel tank punctured during the morning attack on Midway, but he pressed his attack with the fatalistic determination that characterized Japanese naval aviation at its finest. The torpedo attack succeeded where the bombing had failed. Two torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, flooding the engine rooms and causing a 26-degree list that made the ship unstable and impossible to maneuver. This time, Captain Buckmaster's order to abandon ship was final. Yorktown would survive until dawn on June 7th, when a Japanese submarine delivered the coup de grace that sent her to the bottom of the Pacific. As historian Craig Simmons noted in the Battle of Midway, Hiryu's successful attacks on Yorktown demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation remained formidable even in defeat, but could no longer alter the strategic balance that had shifted decisively in America's favor. The destruction of Yorktown represented Japan's last tactical victory. At Midway, achieved at enormous cost and without strategic significance, Hiryu's aircraft had expended themselves in the attack, leaving the carrier defenseless against the American counterattack that was already forming up. For the final act of the day's drama. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the Pacific on June 4, 1942, Enterprise and Hornet prepared to deliver the final blow against Japan's last operational carrier. The morning's triumph had cost the Americans dearly. Yorktown lay abandoned and listing. Many of their most experienced pilots were dead or missing, and fuel supplies were running critically low. But Admiral Raymond Spruance understood that Hiryu remained a mortal threat that had to be eliminated before darkness could provide her with an opportunity to escape or launch night attacks. At 5 o'clock in the evening, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 24 dive bombers from Enterprise toward the last symbol of Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific. These pilots were exhausted, having flown multiple missions since dawn, but they carried with them the knowledge that they were participating in one of the most decisive naval battles in history. Intelligence reports indicated that Hiryu was operating alone, separated from any supporting vessels, making her vulnerable to the kind of concentrated attack that had destroyed her sister ships. Captain Tomio Kaku positioned Hiryu for maximum defensive effectiveness, but the carrier's situation was hopeless. Most of her aircraft had been expended in the attacks on Yorktown. Her fighter cover was minimal, and damage from earlier American attacks had degraded her ability to maneuver at high speed. When Gallagher's dive bombers appeared overhead at 5:25, Hiryu could only fight for her life with anti-aircraft guns and the courage of her crew. The attack was methodical and devastating, for direct hits in rapid succession broke Hiryu's back, ignited uncontrollable fires throughout the ship, and left her dead in the water within minutes. Captain Kaku, following the ancient tradition of Japanese naval commanders, chose to go down with his ship rather than survive the destruction of his command. By dawn on June 5th, Hiryu had joined her sister carriers on the bottom of the Pacific, taking with her the last vestiges of Japanese offensive capability in the Central Pacific. The strategic implications of Japan's defeat at Midway extended far beyond the loss of four aircraft carriers and their trained aircrews. The mobile fleet had represented Japan's primary instrument for power projection across the Pacific, the force that had enabled their rapid conquest of territory from Hawaii to Australia. With its destruction, Japan lost not only the ability to conduct major offensive operations, but also the psychological aura of invincibility that had sustained their empire since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Japan's naval strategy and the Midway operation, received news of the disaster while still aboard his flagship Yamato. Hundreds of miles from the battle, the man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild for only 6 months to a year in a war against America watched his predictions come true with devastating accuracy. The empire had indeed run wild for exactly 6 months from Pearl Harbor to Midway, and now faced the prospect of a prolonged war against an enemy with superior industrial capacity and growing tactical expertise. As military historian John Keegan observed in The Price of Admiralty, the Battle of Midway marked the point where Japanese tactical excellence met American strategic superiority, with decisive results that would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. The human cost of Japan's defeat was staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen died in the battle, including many of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. These were pilots who could not be replaced, carrying skills and experience that had taken years to develop. American losses, while significant, were sustainable. The United States possessed the industrial capacity to build new carriers and the training infrastructure to develop new pilots. Japan possessed neither. In the months that followed Midway, Japan would be forced into an increasingly desperate defensive war. fighting to hold onto conquests they could no longer adequately support or reinforce. The empire that had seemed destined to dominate the Pacific had been revealed as fundamentally overextended, dependent on continued victory to maintain momentum they could no longer sustain. The Battle of Midway had lasted less than 24 hours, but it determined the outcome of a war that would continue for 3 more years. Japan's dominance had indeed turned to disaster, and every weakness in their strategic position, from overextension to resource limitations to tactical inflexibility, had been exposed by an enemy who proved more adaptable than anyone in Tokyo had dared imagine.